Hello and welcome to another segment of Good to Know Family Law Topics. Today I'm going to talk about premarital agreements, and if you have a premarital agreement, I'm going to try to address whether or not your premarital agreement is enforceable or not. In discussing this topic, I'm going to talk to you about two primary things. The first is the importance of the date that your agreement was signed, and how that's going to impact the validity of your premarital agreement. The second thing I'm going to talk to you about is some of the facts that the court's going to consider when determining if your premarital agreement is enforceable. Okay, now first let's talk about how the date that you signed the premarital agreement may impact the enforceability of the premarital agreement. The court is going to look at the date because the law has changed considerably over the past 30 years. In fact, it's changed several times. So in other words, if an agreement is signed in 2018, the rules are going to be different than an agreement that was signed in 1998. And in 1988, there were even different rules. So when it was signed is going to be scrutinized as to what the law was. The law was not retroactive when these changes were made. Now, second, in determining the validity of a premarital agreement, the court's going to consider some pretty common sense factors to see whether or not it holds water. First of all, the court's going to look at whether or not the agreement was signed knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. And in doing so, the court's going to see if the party who's contesting the validity of the premarital agreement was represented by an attorney. Now, it's not always necessary in all cases for an attorney to be on both sides, but the court is going to look at that factor, which tells you that that's a pretty important one. The second thing that the court's going to look at is whether or not there was a complete disclosure of all of the assets and debts of the parties. Premarital agreements typically, or should, have a list of the assets and debts of both parties, which is marked as an addendum to the actual agreement. The failure to disclose assets could be a reason for the court to determine the non-enforceability of the agreement. And in fact, a lot of premarital agreements are determined invalid because of that very reason, that assets aren't disclosed. Another very important factor that the court's going to consider is whether or not the agreement was signed under duress or through coercion. In other words, was the agreement signed where there was a lot of pressure from the other party to do so, so much so that it wasn't voluntarily? An example of this would be if a party is handed a premarital agreement on the eve of a wedding date, for example, at a reception dinner. In that case, there's probably not enough time to really review the premarital agreement, and it would be highly embarrassing to call off the wedding, especially when there's a lot of guests that have been invited. So those are some of the reasons that the court may say that the premarital agreement is not enforceable. Now let me conclude with a couple of tips. First of all, consider entering into a postnuptial agreement. A postnuptial agreement is an agreement that is entered into between married people after the date of marriage. It looks a lot like a premarital agreement, but the postnuptial agreement can either ratify the premarital agreement, it can modify the premarital agreement, or it could completely terminate the terms of the premarital agreement. Of course, that's a decision for you and your spouse to make. The second thing to consider is speaking to a well-qualified family law attorney who's actually tried these issues in a court of law. That attorney could give you a feel for whether or not a court is likely to enforce the premarital agreement. And that's all I have today. Thank you again for joining us on Good to Know Family Law Topics. Be sure to read our blog and look to our YouTube videos to learn more about important family law topics.